So as I was saying, Paul here is on Mars Hill. Are we on with the slides, or semi, sorta, maybe? Pretty much. Okay. Scripture. Okay. All righty. We will obviously get everything working together. So let's see how this operates. Let's see how this works. Acts chapter 17, verse 22. We will not make it to 34. But we are following Paul on his second missionary journey. As we saw last week, Paul was alone in Athens, waiting for Silas and Timothy to catch up with him. I had a graphic here. Can you go to the next slide there? And we'll see. That looks totally different from normal, but anyway, whatever. Let's just go on. So he's on his second missionary journey, and there's a map there that shows all the places that Paul and Silas and Timothy and Luke initially had been, and there it is. So we remember that Paul and Timothy, they went from Luke went from Troas to Philippi, and then they went down to Thessalonica, which is right here, and then Berea, and then Paul got shuttled away by himself, and he goes over to Athens. He is now waiting in Athens here. He's waiting for Silas and Timothy to catch up with him, and so he is there in Athens, Greece, in the marketplace, and we saw last week that he was reasoning in the synagogue and in the marketplace, sharing the gospel with both the Jews and Gentiles. And after dialoguing with the philosophers in the marketplace, he was invited to the Areopagus, and last week we talked about that just a little bit. I have a picture of that, if you can go to the next slide, and you can see the picture of Mars Hill right here, the Areopagus. That's the way it looks today, and the Areopagus was up there where it was kind of like the Greek court system. And it was run by some of the elites in Athens. To this day, the Greek Supreme Court is called the Areopagus, and so a lot of things were tried there, and there was some, but mostly ran by the Stoics and Epicureans that we met in the marketplace. And so Paul is invited to go to the Areopagus. Last week I mentioned to you that means the hill of Ares. Ares is the Greek god, and it means the hill of Ares. And the King James calls it Mars Hill because Ares from the Greek gods turned to the Roman god Mars. And so it's the King James updated a little bit and called it Mars Hill. So that's why we call this encounter Paul's encounter on Mars Hill. Now, there's some dispute about the nature of Paul's invitation. He's out in the marketplace, and he is sharing the gospel with people. He's talking about Jesus Christ dying on the cross for our sins and being raised from the dead. And the philosophers that were out there and those who were listening to Paul heard it was very strange. It was a strange idea. In fact, what they heard was not Jesus was raised from the dead. They heard Paul preaching about two new gods that they'd never heard of before, Jesus and Anastasia. Anastasia was the Greek word for resurrection, but they assumed that was another god or a goddess. And so they thought that Paul was preaching about Jesus and the goddess Anastasia. And so it was brand new. It was something that they had never heard of before. And so the Epicureans and the Stoics invited Paul to come to Mars Hill. And what was mentioned last week is that they were addicted to everything new. They hadn't heard it before. They wanted to hear it some more. And so he was invited in a public forum at the Areopagus to lay out what they believed was a new religion, and they wanted to hear more about it. Now, there is a dispute about the nature of Paul's invitation here. Was he under arrest? I mean, this is a court, and so many people think that maybe he was placed under arrest there and he is on trial here. And by the way, this is the very place on top of that hill, this is the very place where Socrates was tried and found guilty of corrupting youth, denying the gods, and maybe even inventing new gods. And so Socrates was tried here and found guilty and was ultimately executed in Athens. And so here's Paul standing right where Socrates stood on his trial. If you ever read the Apology of Socrates by Plato, that is about Socrates' trial on Mars Hill before the Areopagus. So here is Paul standing at this very place. So some people believe that he was on trial like Socrates, but if you'll notice, after Paul finished, he was free to leave. It didn't seem like he was under arrest. It didn't seem like he was in legal trouble. They just wanted to hear something new that they hadn't heard. So other people believe that you really needed permission from the Areopagus. If you're going to go out in the marketplace and teach different doctrines or what they believe to be a new religion, they say that you had to pass that by the Areopagus. You had to have, in essence, a license to go out and preach or teach in the marketplace. Now, that's a kind of speculation. There's not a lot of evidence for that. And it seems to me that the marketplace was a place where new ideas were discussed openly. It was kind of a free speech zone, and you can just talk and discuss things without worrying about being hauled off to jail. Since everyone was addicted to something new, they were there to hear something new. Now, it was probably a combination of a couple things. One is it states here that the philosophers and those in Athens wanted to hear something new, so they were curious about what Paul was preaching. They saw it as maybe a new religion, and they wanted to hear more about this new religion, and so he was taken before this body. Now, Bruce Winter, he wrote a journal article on this that I read about this, and I think that he's onto something here. He said that the Areopagus was also the body or an institution that admitted new gods into the pantheon. Last week I mentioned to you that the pantheon was not a closed canon. You could have new gods introduced. New gods could be introduced, and new temples could be built. New shrines, new marble statues of the gods could be built if you had the financing and the money to do it. And so if you had a new god and you wanted to build a new temple in Athens, you had to come before this body. And so many people believe that they invited Paul because they thought he was a herald of a new religion and was vying for adding some more gods, at least two gods, to their pantheon. And so they would be the ones that decided whether that would take place or not. And as a herald of new gods, that meant that they assumed that Paul, if he was introducing new gods, that he also had the means and the finances to be able to construct a new temple and do all of the necessary things to get these new gods established. So he was taken to Mars Hill before this body, this court, and it was primarily made up of Epicureans and Stoics. And before we get into the text, I probably need to explain a little bit, just a very quick synopsis of who the Epicureans are and who the Stoics are. Maybe you have heard these philosophers before, and maybe you're a little bit aware of their philosophy. But the Epicureans were materialists. They were very much like Western culture today, post-Christianity, with the new scientism and Darwinism, those who deny that God exists or anything spiritual exists, the only thing that exists is matter. And that was the Epicureans. So there's nothing new under the sun. In fact, American culture is very much like the Epicureans, only a little bit worse. And I'll explain that here in just a second. So the Epicureans were materialists, and they believed that everything consisted of atoms and particles. And yes, they used the word atoms back then. Atoms are not a new concept. and even particles. And that's all. That's all that existed, was just the material world of atoms and particles. They didn't believe in the spiritual realm. They did not believe that there was life after death. They really didn't deny the existence of the Greek gods, and they only really did that because culturally they would be shunned if they didn't. And so they kind of had a nod toward the Greek gods. They really didn't believe in them, but they went along with their culture. And if the gods existed in their mind, they were totally indifferent to humanity. And I guess the concept today would be more like deism, this idea that God could have made all things and then he's left mankind on our own, and God doesn't really pay attention to what's going on down here and is indifferent to that. So that's, if the gods exist, they didn't really care, and they weren't involved in everyday affairs. They certainly didn't believe in providence. They believed that everything happened by chance, blind, random chance. And that, again, is very much like our culture. The whole theory of evolution is based on chance. So that's why it's very similar to today's materialism. Now, their philosophy was about living a tranquil life of pleasure. So today, if you call someone an Epicurean, we mean a person that's living for pleasure. Sometimes it has to do with food and all those things. But the Epicureans were not about fleshly material pleasure. In fact, they thought that if you engaged in just the blind pursuit of worldly, material, fleshly pleasure, that would ultimately bring unhappiness in your life in the end. They at least were wise enough to know that. And so what they understood about pleasure was that it was a pleasure that was free from pain, the best you can, free from being led about by your passions, just by your emotions, and free from superstition and fears. And so very much like today's American culture, with the exception that the American culture is now immersed in hedonism, just living for pleasure, just doing whatever they want to do. If it feels right, do it. Just do whatever you want, even though it may destroy your life, destroy your family. It may kill you in the end, but the Americans really don't care about that, just as long as right now I will feel good and find pleasure. And that was a bridge too far for the Epicureans. They would think we are just absolutely insane and bizarre for living that way. But they did want to